Backpackers vanished in 1996. Trail of Terror. Chapter 1. Tasmania, March 1996. The island state sat at the bottom of the world, separated from mainland Australia by the treacherous waters of Bass Strait. It was a place of extraordinary beauty and profound wilderness, where ancient rainforests covered mountain ranges and glacial lakes reflected skies that seemed impossibly vast. For backpackers seeking adventure away from the tourist circuits of Sydney and Melbourne, Tasmania offered pristine trails, challenging hikes, and the kind of untouched nature that was becoming increasingly rare in the modern world. But Tasmania in 1996 also carried shadows from recent history. Just a few years earlier, the backpacker murders, 7 young travelers killed by serial killer Ivan Milat in the forests of New South Wales, had shattered Australia's reputation as a safe destination for international tourists. Though Milat's hunting ground had been hundreds of miles away on the mainland, the psychological impact rippled across the country. Parents in Europe worried when their children announced plans to backpack through Australia. Hostels displayed safety information more prominently. And yet, the adventurous young continued to come, drawn by the landscape and the promise of experiences they couldn't find at home. Lars Andersson arrived in Hobart, Tasmania's capital, on March 10, 1996. He was 24 years old, tall and lean with the sun-bleached hair of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Lars was completing his master's degree in biology at Uppsala University in Sweden, and he had taken a semester off to travel through Australia and New Zealand, studying unique ecosystems and photographing wildlife. He had already spent 3 months on the mainland, working odd jobs to fund his travels, sleeping in hostels and occasionally camping in national parks. Tasmania was to be the final leg of his Australian adventure before he flew to New Zealand. He had saved the island for last, attracted by reports of its pristine wilderness and the famous Overland Track, a 6-day, 80-kilometer hike through Cradle Mountain Lake St. Clair National Park that was considered one of Australia's premier wilderness walks. Lars checked into the Salamanca Backpackers Hostel in Hobart, a converted warehouse near the historic waterfront. The hostel was busy with international travelers, most of them young Europeans taking gap years or extended trips between university and career. It was here that Lars met Kathrin Schmidt and Pierre Dubois. Kathrin was 23, from Munich, a primary school teacher who had saved for 3 years to fund a 6-month trip around the world. She had started in Southeast Asia, worked her way through India and Nepal, and was now in the Australian leg of her journey. She was practical and organized, the kind of person who researched every destination thoroughly and always had a first aid kit and emergency supplies in her backpack. Her friends at home had worried about her traveling alone, but Kathrin had assured them she would be careful, would avoid risks, would stay in touch regularly. Pierre was 26, from Lyon, a freelance photographer who funded his travels by selling images to travel magazines and stock photo agencies. He was charming and gregarious, fluent in 4 languages, with an easy smile that made him popular in hostels wherever he went. He had been traveling for 8 months, moving slowly through Australia, taking thousands of photographs of landscapes and wildlife. Tasmania was special to him. Its dramatic scenery and unique light conditions made it a photographer's paradise. The 3 met in the hostel's common room on the evening of March 11th. Each planning their Tasmanian itineraries independently, they discovered they all wanted to hike the Overland Track and, after comparing schedules and experience levels, decided to do it together. Solo hiking was possible but not recommended in Tasmania's wilderness, where weather could change rapidly and help was far away. 3 experienced hikers traveling together would be safer and more enjoyable than going alone. They spent the next few days in Hobart, organizing supplies and registering for their hike. The Overland Track required advance registration with Parks and Wildlife, and hikers were expected to sign in and out at ranger stations to ensure everyone was accounted for. Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre registered as a group, planning to enter the trail on March 17th and complete it by March 23rd. On March 16th, they took a bus to Launceston, then hired a car to drive to Cradle Mountain, the northern entrance to the Overland Track. They stayed overnight at a backpacker's lodge run by Margaret Foster, a woman in her 60s who had been hosting hikers for 20 years. Margaret would later tell police that the 3 seemed well prepared and in good spirits, excited about the hike ahead. They were lovely young people, Margaret would say. Polite, responsible. They showed me their gear, asked about weather conditions, took my advice about the route. They weren't reckless or foolish. They knew what they were doing. On the morning of March 17th, Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre signed in at the Cradle Mountain Ranger Station, officially beginning their trek. The weather was clear, with temperatures around 15 degrees Celsius, ideal hiking conditions. Ranger station logs noted that they departed at 8:30 a.m., each carrying packs weighing approximately 20 kilograms with food, camping gear, and supplies for 6 days on the trail. The Overland Track winds through some of Tasmania's most spectacular terrain. From Cradle Mountain, the trail climbs through alpine heath and button-grass moorlands, past glacial lakes and ancient forests, across mountain passes that offer sweeping views of jagged peaks and endless wilderness. It's challenging but well-marked, with basic huts spaced along the route where hikers can shelter if weather turns bad. Most people complete the walk in 5 to 6 days, though experienced hikers can do it faster. For the first 3 days, everything appeared normal. Other hikers on the trail reported encountering the 3 Europeans at various points. A British couple passed them near Windermere Hut on the second day and exchanged pleasantries about the beautiful weather. An Australian solo hiker shared a campsite with them on the 3rd night and later described them as competent and cheerful, cooking dinner together and discussing plans to complete the track and then explore the west coast. But on the 4th day, March 20th, something happened that would turn a routine wilderness hike into one of Australia's most baffling missing persons cases. Chapter 2. Michael Chen was a 32-year-old ranger with Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Service, responsible for maintaining sections of the Overland Track and ensuring hiker safety. On March 25th, 2 days after Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre should have completed their hike and signed out at the Lake St. Clair end of the trail, Chen received a call from his supervisor. "We've got 3 hikers who haven't signed out," the supervisor said. "European group, registered for March 17th to 23rd. They're 8 days overdue now. Their emergency contacts have been trying to reach them and are starting to panic. I need you to do a search of the trail. See if you can locate them." Chen felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Overdue hikers usually meant one of 3 things. They had finished the hike, but forgotten to sign out. They had decided to extend their trip and hadn't bothered to update their registration, or something had gone wrong on the trail. The first 2 scenarios were frustrating, but harmless. The third could be tragic. Chen gathered his gear, first aid supplies, emergency beacon, satellite phone, and headed up the trail from the Lake St. Clair end, working backwards along the route the hikers would have taken. The weather had been mostly clear for the past week, with only light rain on one day, so conditions wouldn't have been particularly dangerous. Still, accidents happened. People fell, got lost, suffered medical emergencies in remote locations where help was hours or days away. He hiked through the morning, checking the trail huts and common camping spots, looking for any sign of the 3 Europeans. At Narcissus Hut, he found the logbook where hikers typically recorded their progress. Flipping back through the entries, he found the names: Lars Andersson, Kathrin Schmidt, Pierre Dubois. They had signed in on March 19th, noted as staying overnight. Their entry indicated they planned to complete the hike the next day, March 20th, but there was no corresponding exit entry. They had never reached Lake St. Clair. Chen continued up the trail, now moving with increased urgency. If they had been on the trail for 9 days, they would have run out of food. If they were injured and unable to move, they would be in serious trouble. Tasmania's wilderness was unforgiving. Nighttime temperatures could drop near freezing even in summer, and the dense bush made it easy to become disoriented if you left the marked trail. It was late afternoon when Chen found their camp. The site was near Pelion Gap, a windswept mountain pass about 2/3 of the way through the Overland Track. It was a common camping spot, with flat ground and access to water from a nearby creek. But as Chen approached, he could tell immediately that something was very wrong. 2 tents were still standing, though one had partially collapsed. A 3rd tent appeared to have been torn down or dismantled. Camping gear was scattered across the site: sleeping bags, clothing, cooking equipment strewn in what looked like chaos rather than normal camp organization. The remains of a campfire sat in a stone ring, long cold. Chen called out, his voice echoing across the empty landscape. "Hello, is anyone here? Lars? Kathrin? Pierre?" No response, just the wind whistling through the button grass and the distant call of a raven. Chen approached the campsite carefully, his ranger training taking over. He noted details that might be important: the position of equipment, signs of struggle or violence, anything that might explain what had happened. What he saw made his blood run cold. At the entrance to one of the collapsed tents, There were dark stains on the fabric. Chen crouched down to examine them more closely, though he already knew what they were. Blood. Definitely blood, and not just a small amount from a cut finger or nosebleed. These were significant stains, the kind that came from serious injury. Near the tent entrance, the ground showed signs of disturbance, what might have been drag marks leading away from the campsite toward the dense scrub forest that bordered the clearing. Chen followed the marks for about 20 meters before they disappeared into undergrowth so thick he couldn't continue without a machete. He returned to the campsite and conducted a thorough search. The hikers' 3 backpacks were still there, tucked inside the standing tent. He opened them carefully, finding passports, money, cameras, journals, everything you would expect backpackers to have with them. Their food supplies were mostly depleted but not entirely gone. Kathrin's first aid kit was untouched. Pierre's expensive camera equipment was intact. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't robbery. The hikers hadn't packed up and left voluntarily, because all their essential gear remained, and the blood suggested violence, possibly serious violence. Chen used his satellite phone to call emergency services. "I've found the missing hikers' campsite," he reported. "They're not here, but there's evidence of blood and possible struggle. I need police and a search and rescue team immediately, and you should probably notify next of kin. This looks bad." By nightfall, the first rescue personnel were arriving at Cradle Mountain, preparing for a major search operation that would begin at first light. Chen remained at the campsite, guarding it as a potential crime scene, spending a sleepless night in his tent while the wind howled across Pelion Gap, and he thought about 3 young people who had come to Tasmania seeking adventure and had instead found something terrible. Chapter 3. Detective Senior Constable Robert Harrison arrived at the campsite the next morning as part of a joint Tasmania police and search and rescue operation. Harrison was 46 years old, a veteran investigator with 20 years' experience, most of it in major crimes. He had worked homicides, missing persons, and serious assaults. But as he surveyed the abandoned campsite and the blood evidence, he felt a familiar sense of dread. This had all the hallmarks of a case that would haunt him. The search operation was massive by Tasmanian standards. 50 police officers, 40 search and rescue volunteers, park rangers, and even Australian Defence Force personnel deployed to comb through the surrounding wilderness. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the rugged terrain. Tracker dogs were brought in to follow scent trails from the bloodstains. The dogs picked up trails leading away from the campsite, but the scents dissipated quickly in the rocky, vegetation-dense environment. The helicopter searches spotted nothing unusual. No bodies, no signs of people moving through the bush. Ground teams pushed through thick scrub forest, calling out names, looking for any indication of where Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre might have gone. Harrison coordinated the forensic examination of the campsite. A team from Forensic Science Service Tasmania carefully documented everything, photographing the scene from every angle, collecting the blood samples, mapping the positions of equipment, and the drag marks Chen had noticed. The blood analysis would take time, but preliminary tests confirmed it was human blood from at least 2 different individuals. The amount suggested serious injury, arterial bleeding or deep wounds, but not necessarily fatal quantities. People could survive losing this much blood if they received medical attention quickly. But out here, hours from help, serious bleeding would likely be fatal without immediate treatment. "What's your theory?" Inspector David Matthews asked Harrison. Matthews had been sent from Hobart to coordinate what was rapidly becoming a high-profile investigation, especially after European embassies began making inquiries about their missing citizens. "I'm trying to work out what could cause 3 experienced hikers to abandon camp in the middle of nowhere, leaving all their gear behind," Harrison said. "The blood suggests violence, but violence from what? Or whom? Could it have been an animal attack?" Matthews suggested. "Tasmania has some of the world's largest carnivorous marsupials. A Tasmanian devil attack, maybe?" Harrison shook his head. "Devils are scavengers primarily. They're not large enough or aggressive enough to attack 3 adult humans. And if an animal had attacked, we'd expect to find remains, or at least more blood and signs of predation. What about other hikers? Could this have been a human attack?" "Possible," Harrison admitted. "But we've accounted for every other registered hiker on the trail during the relevant period. All of them have checked out okay. If someone attacked these 3, it would have to be someone hiking illegally, off the books. Or someone who lives in the area, a local who knows the bush." The theory of a local perpetrator seemed far-fetched. The nearest town was hours away, and the Overland Track ran through uninhabited wilderness, but it couldn't be completely dismissed. Australia's history included cases of remote area crimes, including the backpacker murders, that were still fresh in public consciousness. Over the following week, the search expanded to cover 50 square kilometers of wilderness around the campsite. Teams waded through freezing rivers, climbed steep slopes, pushed through temperate rainforests so dense that visibility was reduced to a few meters. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no equipment, no sign that Lars, Kathrin, or Pierre had been anywhere in the search area. It was as if they had simply vanished. The media coverage intensified. 3 European backpackers missing in Tasmania became international news. Reporters from Sweden, Germany, and France flew to Hobart, broadcasting from the search headquarters, interviewing officials and other hikers. The story drew inevitable comparisons to the backpacker murders, with headlines asking whether Australia was safe for international tourists. The pressure on investigators was immense. The Swedish, German, and French embassies sent officials to Tasmania, demanding updates and applying diplomatic pressure for answers. The families of the missing hikers arrived in Australia, desperate for news. Lars's parents, Kathrin's sister, Pierre's mother, all flew to the other side of the world, hoping to bring their loved ones home, knowing with each passing day that hope was fading. Harrison interviewed them all, these shattered families seeking answers he couldn't provide. Sitting across from Lars's mother, watching her grip a photograph of her son, he felt the weight of his failure to find them. He was so excited about this trip, Mrs. Anderson said, her English accented but clear. He called me from Hobart the week before he went on the hike. He said Tasmania was beautiful, that he was meeting wonderful people. He said he felt safe. How did this happen? How do 3 people just disappear? Harrison had no answer. He could only promise to continue searching, to follow every lead, to work the case until they found something. But privately, he was beginning to fear they would never know what happened on Pelion Gap. Chapter 4. The forensic results came back 2 weeks after the disappearance. Dr. Sarah Williams, the forensic pathologist who analyzed the blood evidence, met with Harrison and Matthews to present her findings. We identified blood from all 3 victims at the campsite, Williams explained. Lars Andersson, Kathrin Schmidt, and Pierre Dubois. The DNA matches were definitive. The blood patterns suggest at least 2 of them suffered significant injuries, possibly knife wounds or similar trauma based on the arterial spray pattern we found on one of the tent walls. Knife wounds? Matthews repeated. So we're definitely looking at a human attacker? Almost certainly. The blood evidence is inconsistent with animal attack. The patterns suggest deliberate violence against multiple victims in rapid succession. Harrison studied the forensic photographs. Walk me through what you think happened. Williams pulled up a diagram showing the reconstructed sequence. Based on blood spatter analysis, I believe the attack occurred inside or immediately outside this tent here. She indicated the partially collapsed structure. The victims were likely ambushed while they were sleeping or in their shelter. At least 1 victim fought back. We found defensive wounds consistent with raised hands blocking blows. The attacker used a sharp weapon, possibly a large knife or machete. Then what? Harrison asked. Then the bodies were moved. The drag marks Chen found suggest at least 2 victims were pulled away from the campsite, while still alive or very recently deceased. The blood trail is consistent with continued bleeding during transport. The 3rd victim's fate is unclear, but presumably, they were also removed from the site. Why take the bodies? Matthews wondered. Why not just leave them and flee? That's the disturbing part, Williams said. Removing bodies from a crime scene suggests the perpetrator wanted to prevent identification, delay discovery, or hide evidence of their method. It shows planning and effort. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was deliberate. The investigation shifted focus. If this was murder by a human attacker who had gone to significant effort to hide the bodies, then the perpetrator was likely someone with knowledge of the area, physical capability to move bodies through difficult terrain, and motivation to target these specific backpackers or backpackers in general. Harrison created a profile of potential suspects. Someone familiar with the Overland Track and surrounding wilderness, physical fit enough to overpower 3 young adults and transport bodies. Access to weapons and possibly camping gear, to survive in the wilderness themselves, motivation to target foreign tourists, or possibly a specific grudge against these individuals. The list of people matching this profile was disturbingly long. Park rangers, experienced bushwalkers, hunters, anyone who regularly spent time in Tasmania's wilderness could potentially fit. Harrison's team began the tedious work of identifying and interviewing everyone who might have been in the area. They interviewed Margaret Foster, the lodge owner who had hosted the 3 hikers the night before they started the trek. She remembered them clearly and was devastated to learn they were likely dead. "Did you notice anyone else showing unusual interest in them?" Harrison asked. "Anyone who seemed to be watching them or asking questions about their plans?" Margaret thought carefully. "There was another guest staying here that night. An Australian man, maybe 40s, said he was doing some photography work in the park. He ate dinner in the common area, same time as those 3 young people. They chatted a bit about the Overland Track, compared cameras because Pierre was also a photographer. But it seemed like normal traveler conversation. Do you have a name for this man? He signed the guest book. Let me check." Margaret retrieved her records. Robert Mitchell. He paid cash, didn't provide an address. Said he was from Melbourne originally, but had been traveling around Tasmania for a few weeks. Harrison felt his pulse quicken. A man with photography equipment as cover, who had interacted with the victims the night before they vanished, who paid cash and provided minimal information. Did he leave with them the next morning? No. He stayed another night here. Said he wasn't in any rush. Wanted to take photos around Cradle Mountain. Do you have any photographs of this man? Security cameras? We don't have security cameras, but I might have some snapshots. I sometimes take photos of guests for the hostel scrapbook. Margaret searched through albums and found several images from mid-March. In one, a man with dark hair and sunglasses stood near the hostel entrance. His face was partially obscured, but it was something. "Can I take this?" Harrison asked. "Of course. Do you think he's involved?" "I think he's someone we need to find." The search for Robert Mitchell led nowhere. The name was too common. Tens of thousands of Robert Mitchells in Australia alone. Without additional identification, they couldn't narrow it down. The photograph was distributed to media, but no one came forward with useful information. If Robert Mitchell was a false name, which seemed likely, the trail was completely cold. Chapter 5. 3 months after the disappearance, the active search was scaled back. 50 square kilometers of wilderness had been searched without finding any trace of the 3 missing backpackers beyond the blood at their campsite. The prevailing theory was that they had been murdered and their bodies hidden or disposed of in one of Tasmania's countless deep ravines, dense forests, or remote caves where they might never be found. The case remained open, but with no new leads and limited resources, active investigation ceased. Harrison continued to work it in whatever spare time he could find, but he had other cases demanding attention. Tasmania was experiencing its own increase in serious crime, and missing persons cases from years past couldn't monopolize police resources indefinitely. The families refused to accept that their loved ones were gone. Lars's parents established a foundation to search for missing persons in wilderness areas. Kathrin's sister mounted social media campaigns to keep the case in public consciousness. Pierre's mother traveled to Tasmania multiple times, hiking sections of the Overland Track herself, somehow hoping to find clues that professional searchers had missed. The European embassies maintained pressure on Australian authorities, submitting formal requests for the case to be investigated as potential serial murder rather than isolated incident. They cited the backpacker murders, arguing that Tasmania's remote trails could be hunting grounds for a predator who targeted foreign tourists. In response, police conducted reviews of all unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths in Tasmania over the previous decade. They found 3 other cases that bore some similarities. A solo German hiker who disappeared in 1991 on a coastal trail. His body was found 6 months later, cause of death undetermined. A British couple who vanished in 1993 while camping near Cradle Mountain, never found. An American woman who disappeared in 1995 from a trail near Lake St. Clair. Her backpack was found, but she was not. Were these cases connected? The evidence was circumstantial at best. Wilderness deaths and disappearances were tragic, but not uncommon in Tasmania's rugged environment. People fell from cliffs, got lost in bad weather, suffered medical emergencies far from help. Not every missing person was a murder victim, but the pattern troubled Harrison. 4 groups of foreign tourists, all experienced hikers, all vanishing without trace in remote areas of Tasmania over a 5-year period. The statistical probability seemed too high to be coincidence. He presented his concerns to Inspector Matthews. "I think we might have a serial killer operating in Tasmania's national parks. Someone who targets foreign hikers, knows the terrain well enough to hide bodies, and has been getting away with it for years." Matthews was skeptical. That's a serious allegation based on very limited evidence. We don't have a single confirmed homicide in any of these cases except possibly the 3 Europeans. The others could be accidents, misadventures, people who decided to disappear voluntarily. But what if they're not? What if there's someone out there who's killed 6 or 7 people and we haven't connected the dots? Then find me evidence, Matthews said. Real evidence, not just patterns and speculation. Give me a suspect, a weapon, a witness, something concrete. Because right now, all we have is tragic coincidences. Harrison knew Matthews was right. Without bodies, without witnesses, without physical evidence connecting the cases, he couldn't prove anything. But his instincts told him something dark was happening in Tasmania's wilderness, something that would continue unless they found a way to stop it. Chapter 6. In 1998, 2 years after the disappearance of Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre, a breakthrough seemed to occur. A convicted burglar named Trevor Walsh, serving time in Risdon Prison in Hobart, requested to speak with police about unsolved murders in the bush. Harrison drove to the prison, hoping this might finally be the lead that cracked the case. Walsh was 38, a career criminal with convictions for burglary, assault, and drug offenses. He was rough-looking, tattooed, with the hardened demeanor of someone who had spent significant time incarcerated. "I know what happened to those backpackers," Walsh said once they were alone in the interview room. "The Europeans who vanished in '96. I know who did it." Harrison kept his expression neutral. Prison confessions were notoriously unreliable. Inmates seeking attention, reduced sentences, or simply entertainment often fabricated stories about unsolved crimes. "Tell me what you know." "There's a bloke I knew. Did some hunting with him back in the day. Real bushman. Lived off the grid up near Cradle Mountain. He hated tourists. Thought they were destroying Tasmania's wilderness. He used to talk about teaching them lessons, about how they didn't belong in the bush. What's his name? Goes by Jack. Don't know if that's his real name. Nobody ever asked. Where can we find him?" That's the thing. He disappeared himself, right around the time those backpackers went missing. I heard through the grapevine he'd gone bush permanently, living somewhere deep in the wilderness where nobody could find him. Harrison interviewed Walsh for 3 hours, pressing for specific details, trying to separate fact from fiction. Walsh claimed Jack was an ex-military man, possibly from Melbourne originally, who had moved to Tasmania in the late 1980s and gradually retreated from society into the wilderness. He supposedly had extensive survival skills, knowledge of the national parks, and access to weapons. "Did Jack ever tell you he had killed anyone?" Harrison asked. "Not directly, but he said things. Like how easy it would be to make people disappear in the bush, how nobody would ever find bodies if you knew where to put them. And after those backpackers went missing, he made comments to me about tourists finally learning their lesson." "When was the last time you saw Jack?" "Maybe a month before the disappearances. We ran into each other in a pub in Queenstown. He was drunk, rambling about how the parks were getting too crowded, how something needed to be done. Then he vanished. I figured he'd just gone deeper bush, like he always talked about." Harrison showed Walsh the photograph of Robert Mitchell from Margaret Foster's hostel. "Is this Jack?" Walsh studied it carefully. "Could be. The hair and build are about right, but I can't say for certain with the sunglasses." Following up on Walsh's information proved frustrating. The description of Jack was too vague to be useful. Thousands of men in Tasmania could fit it. Ex-military, bushman, recluse, who might be living off-grid somewhere in the vast wilderness. Without a full name, military records, or more specific identifying information, tracking him down was nearly impossible. Harrison assigned officers to search military records for anyone matching the description who had served in Tasmania or moved there after discharge. They found dozens of possibilities, but no way to narrow it down further. Many ex-service members chose remote lifestyles after leaving the military. It wasn't illegal, or even particularly unusual. Teams conducted searches of known off-grid settlements and remote campsites in the Cradle Mountain region, looking for someone matching Jack's description. They found a handful of hermits and wilderness dwellers, but none seemed to be the person Walsh described, and all had alibis or explanations for their whereabouts in March 1996. Eventually, Harrison concluded that Walsh's information was either false or too vague to be actionable. The lead that had seemed so promising turned into another dead end. Chapter 7. By 2000, 4 years after the disappearance, the case had gone completely cold. Harrison retired from Tasmania Police, the case unsolved despite his years of effort. New investigators took over the files, but without new evidence, there was little they could do. The families of Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre held memorial services in their home countries, acknowledging what they had known for years. Their loved ones were almost certainly dead, murdered by someone who would likely never face justice. The grief was compounded by the lack of closure, the absence of bodies to bury, the endless wondering about final moments and final suffering. In 2005, a logging crew working in remote bush about 15 kilometers from the Overland Track discovered human remains. The bones were scattered, partially buried, and showed signs of animal scavenging. They were immediately turned over to police, who hoped they might finally be the missing backpackers. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to a single individual, Kathrin Schmidt. She had been dead for approximately 9 years, consistent with the 1996 disappearance. The cause of death could not be determined due to the degraded state of the remains, but trauma to several ribs suggested possible blunt force injury before death. The discovery reopened the case. If Kathrin's body had been found 15 kilometers from the campsite, there was a chance Lars and Pierre might be found nearby. A new search operation was launched, focusing on the area where Kathrin was discovered. Ground-penetrating radar was used. Cadaver dogs were deployed. The surrounding region was searched meter by meter. Nothing was found. After 6 weeks, the search was called off. Lars Andersson and Pierre Dubois remained missing, their fate unknown despite the discovery of their companion's body. The finding of Kathrin's remains did confirm one thing. The 3 backpackers had been victims of homicide, not accident or misadventure. Someone had killed them, moved their bodies significant distances from the campsite, and hidden them where they might never be found. That person had gotten away with it for nearly a decade, and might never be caught. Epilogue. The case of the vanished backpackers remains officially unsolved. Kathrin Schmidt's remains were returned to her family in Germany, where she was finally laid to rest 12 years after her disappearance. Lars Andersson and Pierre Dubois are still missing, their bodies never recovered despite multiple searches over the decades. The Overland Track remains one of Australia's premier hiking destinations, walked by thousands of people each year. Modern safety measures are more stringent: mandatory registration, GPS tracking devices, regular check-ins. But the wilderness is still wilderness, vast and indifferent to human presence. In 2010, Trevor Walsh recanted his story about Jack, admitting he had fabricated most of it in hope of getting transferred to a lower security facility. The man he described might not have existed at all. The Robert Mitchell, who stayed at Margaret Foster's hostel, was never identified or located. Theories about what happened continue to circulate. Some investigators still believe there's a serial killer operating in Tasmania's wilderness, someone who targets tourists and has successfully evaded detection for decades. Others think the disappearance was an isolated incident by an opportunistic killer who happened to encounter the backpackers at the wrong time and place. A few still argue it could have been a tragic accident, all 3 somehow falling into a hidden ravine or cave system, their bodies buried where no search could find them. But those who studied the evidence closely know the truth. This was murder, deliberate and planned, carried out by someone who knew how to make people disappear in the vast Tasmanian wilderness. Lars Andersson would be 53 years old today if he had lived. Kathrin Schmidt would be 51. Pierre Dubois would be 55. Their families are elderly now, carrying grief that has never fully healed because the questions were never fully answered. The campsite at Pelion Gap where their lives ended is not marked or memorialized. It's just another clearing along the trail where hikers occasionally pitch their tents, unaware of what happened there in March 1996. Sometimes, rangers walking past report an uneasy feeling in that spot, though they can't explain why. The case remains in the files of Tasmania Police, classified as unsolved homicide. Every few years, someone reviews it hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators missed, but the physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead or unreachable, and the perpetrator, if still alive, has successfully hidden their crime for nearly 3 decades. 3 young Europeans came to Tasmania seeking adventure. Drawn by the pristine wilderness and challenging trails, they found terror instead, and their story serves as a grim reminder that even in the modern world, there are places where people can vanish without trace, crimes that remain unsolved, killers who escape justice. The trail of terror that began in March 1996 never truly ended. It simply faded into the wilderness, swallowed by Tasmania's vast forests and mountains, leaving behind only blood, bones, and unanswered questions that will likely never be resolved. Chapter 8. The years following Kathrin Schmidt's discovery brought renewed but ultimately fruitless efforts to solve the case. Detective Sarah Chen, who inherited the case from Harrison, became obsessed with finding answers. She was 32 years old when she took over the investigation in 2006, young enough to bring fresh energy, but experienced enough to understand the challenges of cold cases. Chen began by re-interviewing everyone connected to the original investigation. Margaret Foster, now in her 80s, still remembered the 3 backpackers vividly. "I've had thousands of guests over the years," she told Chen, "but those 3 I'll never forget. They were so full of life, so excited about their adventure. And that man, the one who called himself Robert Mitchell, I wish I had paid more attention to him, gotten more information. Maybe I could have prevented what happened." "You couldn't have known," Chen said gently. "Tell me again everything you remember about him." Margaret closed her eyes, reaching back into memory. He was quiet, polite but reserved. Mid-40s maybe, though it's hard to say with certainty. Average height, maybe 5'10" or 11. Dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore glasses when he was reading but took them off for distance. His hands, I remember his hands were scarred, like someone who worked with tools or machinery. And he had an accent, very faint, but I couldn't place it. Might have been from somewhere rural, or maybe he'd lived overseas for a time. Did he interact much with the other guests? Only with those 3 Europeans. He seemed interested in their photography equipment. Asked Pierre a lot of questions about cameras and lenses. At the time, I thought it was just professional curiosity. He said he was a photographer too. But now I wonder if he was sizing them up, planning something. Chen showed Margaret updated composite sketches created by a police artist based on all available descriptions. Margaret studied them carefully. The second one, that's closer. The jaw is more right. The eyes. But something's still off. I wish I could be more helpful. "You're doing fine," Chen assured her. "Even small details can matter." Chen also tracked down some of the other hikers who had been on the Overland Track. In March 1996, a British couple, now divorced but still in contact, agreed to speak with her separately. James Worthington remembered encountering the 3 Europeans on the 2nd day of their hike. They seemed like typical backpackers, Worthington told Chen via video call from London. Happy, energetic, taking photos of everything. The Swedish fellow Lars was particularly interested in the native flora. He kept stopping to photograph plants and take notes. The German girl, Kathrin, was very organized. She had maps and guidebooks and was constantly checking their progress against the plan. And the French photographer was charming, made jokes, lightened the mood. "Did you see anyone else on the trail who seemed unusual or out of place?" "The trail was pretty busy that week. School holidays or something, I think. We passed maybe a dozen other groups. Most were families or pairs of hikers. I do remember one solo hiker, an older man, maybe 50s, who seemed to be moving very fast. He passed us twice in one day, which was odd because usually you don't see the same person repeatedly on a linear trail like that. He must have been doubling back for some reason." "Can you describe him?" "Tall, very fit for his age, wearing expensive hiking gear, the kind serious bushwalkers use. He had a large pack, bigger than you'd need for the Overland Track if you were staying in huts. He nodded when he passed but didn't stop to chat. I got the impression he didn't want to interact with other hikers. Did you mention this man to police at the time?" "I don't think so. I didn't think anything of it until you asked. Solo hikers aren't unusual, and there's no law against being antisocial on the trail." Chen felt a familiar frustration. So many potential leads that hadn't been followed up properly in the initial investigation. But that was often how cold cases worked. Years later, witnesses remembered details they hadn't thought important at the time, or hadn't been asked about specifically. She expanded her investigation to look at all registered hikers on the Overland Track between March 15th and March 22nd, 1996. The registration records from that era were incomplete. Not everyone signed in and out properly, and some entries were illegible or missing key information. But she compiled a list of 73 individuals or groups known to have been on the trail during the relevant period. Most could be eliminated quickly. Families with children, elderly couples, groups of women. None fit the profile of someone capable of overpowering and killing 3 fit young adults. That left maybe 25 solo male hikers or pairs of men who could potentially have been involved. Chen tracked down as many as possible. Some had died in the intervening years. Others had moved overseas or couldn't be located. Several didn't remember their 1996 hike in any detail. It had been just one of many trips, not particularly memorable. A few were hostile when questioned, objecting to being treated as potential suspects in a murder investigation. One man, Graham Foster, no relation to Margaret, was particularly interesting. He had been hiking solo on the Overland Track and had signed in on March 17th, the same day as the 3 Europeans. His registration listed him as from Tasmania, age 47, planning to complete the track in 4 days. Chen found Foster still living in Tasmania, now 76 years old, and retired from his career as a civil engineer. She visited him at his home in Launceston, finding a well-kept house and a man who seemed genuinely cooperative. "I remember that hike," Foster said. "It was my 20th time doing the Overland Track. I used to do it at least once a year, sometimes twice. It was my escape from work stress, my meditation. Do you remember encountering 3 European backpackers?" "Vaguely. I passed a lot of people on the trail that trip. March was always busy. I might have seen them at Windermere Hut or one of the other stops." "What about March 20th? Do you remember where you were that day?" Foster pulled out a journal. "I kept records of all my hikes. Let me check." He flipped through pages filled with neat handwriting. March 20th, 1996. "I was approaching Pelion Gap. Camped that night at Windy Ridge. The next day I finished the track and drove home. Did you see or hear anything unusual that night? Anything that seemed off?" Foster thought carefully. "There was a ranger helicopter that afternoon, flying search patterns. I thought maybe someone had gotten injured, and that evening, I heard what might have been shouting in the distance, but sound carries strangely in the mountains. Could have been birds, or wind, or people calling to each other. I didn't think anything of it." "Shouting from which direction?" "South, I think, back toward Pelion Gap. But I was several kilometers away by then, and like I said, it was very faint. I might have imagined it." Chen made detailed notes. This timeline was interesting. If Foster had heard shouting on the evening of March 20th coming from the direction of Pelion Gap, that might have been the attack occurring. But Foster had been too far away to see anything, and he had continued his hike the next day, unaware that 3 people had just been murdered a few kilometers behind him. "Did you mention the shouting to police when you heard about the disappearance?" "I didn't hear about it until weeks later. By then I figured it was too late to matter, and I wasn't even sure I'd actually heard it. You spend enough time alone in the wilderness. You start to question what's real and what's your mind playing tricks." Chen thanked Foster and moved on. Every interview added small pieces of information, but none of them formed a coherent picture of what had happened or who was responsible. Chapter 9. In 2008, a true crime documentary crew approached Tasmania police requesting access to the case files for a program about Australia's unsolved disappearances. Chen was initially reluctant. She didn't want the investigation turned into entertainment, but the documentary makers argued that renewed publicity might shake loose new witnesses or information. The documentary, titled Vanished: The Overland Track Murders, aired in 2009 on Australian television and was later distributed internationally. It presented the case methodically, interviewing family members, showing the search operation footage, and exploring various theories about what might have happened. The program generated hundreds of tips. Most were useless. People claiming psychic visions, conspiracy theorists blaming government cover-ups, attention seekers confessing to crimes they couldn't have committed. But a few tips seemed worth investigating. One came from a woman named Patricia Hammond, who had worked as a park ranger in the 1990s. She called the police hotline after seeing the documentary and said she remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now troubled her. In April 1996, about a month after those backpackers disappeared, I was doing trail maintenance near Mount Pelion, Hammond told Chen when they met. I found a cache of supplies hidden in the bush, maybe half a kilometer off the main track. It was well concealed. I only found it because I'd gone off trail to investigate what I thought might be a feral animal den. What kind of supplies? Camping equipment, high-quality stuff, a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, food supplies, and what looked like survival equipment, water purification tablets, emergency medical supplies, rope, a machete. All of it was carefully packed and waterproofed, like someone had stashed it there deliberately as a supply depot. Did you report it? I logged it in my daily report and noted the GPS coordinates. But at the time, it seemed like someone had just left gear behind, maybe planning to retrieve it later. Bush cache camps aren't illegal, and experienced hikers sometimes stash supplies along routes they use frequently. I didn't connect it to the missing backpackers. Do you still have the coordinates? They should be in the park, service archives, and if the cache wasn't disturbed, some of it might still be there. It was very well hidden. Chen immediately organized a search team to revisit the location Hammond had described. Using the archived GPS coordinates, they located the spot, a small rocky overhang in dense scrub forest, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The cache was still there, though much of it had degraded over 13 years of exposure to Tasmania's weather. But some items remained intact, protected by their waterproof packaging. Chen carefully documented everything before having it collected as potential evidence. The most interesting item was a journal, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. The pages were water-damaged but partially legible. The entries were dated from 1994 to early 1996, written in cramped handwriting that was difficult to read. The content was disturbing, rambling thoughts about wilderness survival, resentment toward tourists and city people who didn't respect the bush, and increasingly paranoid fantasies about teaching trespassers lessons. One entry from February 1996 read, "The track is overrun now. Every day more of them come, trampling everything, leaving their garbage, disturbing the wildlife. Someone needs to make them understand this land isn't theirs to exploit. Someone needs to show them consequences." Another entry from March 1996, written the day before the 3 backpackers started their hike. 3 more arrived today. Europeans, young and arrogant, thinking they can conquer this place with their expensive gear and guidebooks. They have no idea what the wilderness really is. Maybe it's time for a demonstration. The final entry was dated March 21st, the day after the attack. "It's done. They learned. Now I disappear. The police will search, but they won't find me. I know this country better than anyone. I am part of it. I don't exist in their world anymore." Chen felt her pulse racing. This journal was effectively a confession. Someone had been stalking hikers on the Overland Track, had specifically targeted Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre, and had carried out a premeditated attack. The writer had then gone into deep hiding in the wilderness, living off cached supplies, staying one step ahead of searchers. But who had written the journal? The handwriting was analyzed, but couldn't be matched to any known person. There was no name, no identifying information. The entries suggested someone with extensive bushcraft knowledge, military or survival training, and severe antisocial tendencies bordering on psychopathic. "This supports the Jack theory," Chen told Inspector Matthews. "Trevor Walsh said there was someone living off-grid, hating tourists, talking about teaching them lessons. This journal could be from that person, or it could be from someone else entirely," Matthews cautioned. "Or it could be a fabrication planted by someone who wants to mislead the investigation. We can't take it at face value without corroboration." DNA testing on the journal revealed traces of biological material, skin cells, sweat, but they didn't match any profile in police databases. The writer had never been arrested or otherwise had their DNA collected. The discovery of the journal brought renewed media attention. Television programs ran updates on the case. The documentary crew released a follow-up episode. International media revisited the story, particularly in Sweden, Germany, and France, where the families of the victims lived. Chapter 10. In 2012, 16 years after the murders, a bushwalker named Thomas Brennan made a macabre discovery. He was exploring an unmapped cave system near Mount Oakley, about 20 kilometers from where Catherine's body had been found, when he discovered human remains deep inside one of the caves. The remains were of 2 individuals, both male based on skeletal analysis. They had been dead for many years. Initial estimates suggested between 10 and 20 years. The cave location was so remote and difficult to access that the bodies had remained undiscovered despite multiple search operations over the years. DNA testing confirmed what many had suspected and feared. The remains belonged to Lars Andersson and Pierre Dubois. After 16 years, the 3 backpackers were finally accounted for. Forensic anthropologists studied the remains carefully, looking for clues about cause of death and how the bodies had ended up in such a remote location. Both men showed evidence of sharp force trauma to their ribs and vertebrae, knife wounds consistent with the blood evidence found at the campsite. Lars had a fractured skull, suggesting he had been hit with a blunt object before being stabbed. The cave where they were found was nearly inaccessible, requiring technical climbing equipment to reach. This suggested the killer had significant climbing skills and had gone to extraordinary effort to hide the bodies where they would likely never be found. The fact that all 3 victims had been moved to different locations, Kathrin 15 kilometers from camp, Lars and Pierre 20 kilometers in a different direction, indicated meticulous planning and physical capability. "We're dealing with someone who knows this terrain intimately," Chen told the task force assembled to review the case. "Someone who can carry bodies through difficult bush, access remote caves, navigate without trails. This isn't a casual killer. This is someone who lives in the wilderness." The discovery of Lars and Pierre's remains allowed the families to finally hold proper funerals. The Andersson family buried Lars in Uppsala, Sweden, 36 years after he had left for his gap year adventure. The Dubois family laid Pierre to rest in Lyon, France. The services were attended by hundreds of people, including representatives from the Australian government, who expressed condolences and renewed pledges to solve the case. But despite having all three bodies, despite the journal, despite 16 years of investigation, police were no closer to identifying the killer. They had a profile, a male, probably in his 40s or 50s at the time of the murders, with extensive wilderness skills and antisocial personality traits. But a profile wasn't a name or an arrest. Chen reviewed every missing person report filed in Tasmania between 1995 and 2000, looking for someone who might have disappeared into the wilderness. She found several possibilities. Men who had left their homes and families, who had stopped using bank accounts and identification, who had effectively ceased to exist in official records. But tracking them down to determine if they were the killer proved impossible. If someone truly wanted to vanish into Tasmania's vast wilderness, they could do so completely. Chapter 11. In 2015, an elderly man named Douglas Grant died in a nursing home in Queensland. He had been suffering from dementia for several years, and in his final weeks, he had made disturbing statements to staff about people in the mountains and stopping the tourists. The nursing home staff initially dismissed these as confusion, but after his death, his daughter contacted police because she had found something troubling among his belongings. Hidden in a locked box in Grant's room was a collection of driver's licenses and passports, 14 in total, belonging to various people who had disappeared in Tasmania and other remote areas of Australia between 1988 and 1997. Among them were the licenses of Lars Andersson, Kathrin Schmidt, and Pierre Dubois. Chen flew to Queensland immediately. This was the break she had been waiting for. Douglas Grant had apparently been a serial killer targeting hikers and backpackers across Australia for nearly a decade. The collection of identification documents was his trophy stash, kept hidden all these years. Investigation into Grant's background revealed a disturbing history. He had served in the Australian Army from 1967 to 1982, including 2 tours in Vietnam, where he had been a reconnaissance specialist. After leaving the military, he had worked various manual labor jobs, but had increasingly withdrawn from society. Tax records showed his last legitimate employment was in 1987. After that, he appeared to have lived off the grid, occasionally resurfacing to collect veterans' benefits, but otherwise leaving no footprint. In 1988, a German backpacker named Klaus Hoffmann had disappeared while hiking in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. His body was never found, but his wallet was among Grant's collection. In 1991, the solo German hiker who vanished in Tasmania, his identification was in the collection too. The British couple from 1993, the American woman from 1995, all their IDs were there. Grant had been killing people for at least 9 years, targeting vulnerable hikers in remote areas, and had gotten away with it completely until his dementia-addled confessions and the discovery of his trophy collection. But Douglas Grant was dead. There would be no trial, no confession, no answers about exact circumstances of the murders or locations of other bodies. The families could take some comfort in knowing who had killed their loved ones, but the ultimate justice of seeing him face consequences was denied to them. Why did he do it? Lars's brother asked Chen when she traveled to Sweden to inform the family. What kind of person kills innocent people just for being in the wilderness? Chen had no good answer. Psychiatric evaluation of Grant's history suggested he had developed an extreme form of territorial obsession, viewing wilderness areas as his domain, and anyone who entered as intruders who deserved punishment. His military training had given him skills to kill efficiently and hide bodies. His isolation had allowed his pathology to grow unchecked for decades. Some people break in ways we can't fully understand, Chen said. Grant's mind created a reality where he was protecting the wilderness by eliminating people he saw as threats. In his twisted logic, he was doing something righteous, but he was just a murderer, nothing more. The discovery of Grant's identity in the trophy collection closed the case officially. Families could finally have some peace knowing their loved one's killer was dead, even if many questions remained unanswered. Chapter 12. In the years following Grant's death, investigators worked to identify all his victims and locate burial sites where possible. Using his trophy collection and cross-referencing unsolved disappearances, they identified 17 confirmed or probable victims across Australia between 1988 and 1997. Search teams excavated the cave where Lars and Pierre were found and discovered Grant's primary wilderness camp nearby, a carefully concealed shelter built from natural materials, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, they found more evidence: camping equipment taken from victims, photographs Grant had taken of people on trails, surveillance before selecting targets, and journals documenting his kills with chilling detachment. One journal entry about the Overland Track murders read, 3 Europeans, young, fit, experienced, good challenge, followed them from the lodge at Cradle Mountain. The photographer noticed me on the trail but dismissed me as another hiker. Took them at Pelion Gap on their 4th night. The French fought hardest. The German girl screamed until I silenced her. The Swede tried to run, but the wilderness is mine, not his. Separated the bodies. They are part of Tasmania now. Reading these cold descriptions of her victims' final moments was devastating for Chen, even after years in law enforcement. She had to step away from the case for several weeks to process the trauma of confronting such evil. The other victims' families were notified. Some bodies were eventually recovered based on clues in Grant's journals and the locations of his wilderness camps. Others remained lost. Tasmania's wilderness was vast enough to hide bodies forever if the killer had chosen concealment sites carefully enough. The revelation that Australia had harbored a serial killer for nearly a decade prompted serious discussions about wilderness safety. New protocols were implemented for national parks, mandatory GPS tracking devices for multi-day hikes, regular check-ins required, increased ranger patrols in remote areas. Some argued these measures destroyed the wilderness experience, but others countered that safety had to be paramount. The European governments that had pressured Australia for answers finally received them, though not in the way anyone had hoped. Their citizens had been murdered by a madman who had evaded justice until dying of natural causes at age 74. Diplomatic relations had been strained for years over the perceived failure to solve the case. But now there was acknowledgement that this had been an exceptionally difficult investigation, complicated by Grant's skill at concealment and the remote terrain. Chapter 13. Chen retired from Tasmania Police in 2018, having spent 12 years obsessed with the backpacker case. She had finally closed it, identified the killer, brought some measure of peace to the families. But the cost had been high. Her marriage had ended under the strain of her obsession, and she suffered from PTSD, triggered by the details of Grant's crimes. "I keep thinking about those 3 young people," she told the police psychologist during mandatory counseling. "They were just living their lives, doing something adventurous but not reckless. They didn't do anything wrong. They were just in the wrong place when a monster decided to act. How do you protect against that? How do you prevent someone like Douglas Grant from existing?" "You can't," the psychologist said. "Evil exists. Mental illness that manifests as violence exists. All you can do is respond to it, investigate it, stop it when possible. You did that. You brought closure that seemed impossible. But closure felt incomplete. 17 families had lost loved ones to Grant's pathology. 17 bright futures had been ended in moments of violence in remote locations. And for 9 years, no one had even suspected a serial killer was operating in Australia's wilderness areas. The case changed how Chen viewed the world. She had always known evil existed, but this was different. This was sustained, purposeful evil that had disguised itself as wilderness isolation. Grant had lived among people periodically, collecting his benefits, shopping in towns, interacting normally. Then he would return to the bush and hunt humans like animals. In retirement, Chen wrote a book about the investigation, titled The Wilderness Killer, Tracking Australia's Most Elusive Serial Murderer. It became a bestseller, particularly in Europe, where the story of the 3 backpackers had never been forgotten. Chen donated all proceeds to organizations supporting families of murder victims and wilderness safety programs. She was interviewed extensively by media, always emphasizing the same points. Wilderness was not inherently dangerous, but complacency about safety could be fatal. Register your hikes, carry communication devices, travel in groups, tell people your plans. These simple precautions would have made Grant's crimes much more difficult, possibly prevented some of them. But we have to be realistic, Chen said in one interview. If someone truly wants to kill in remote areas, they can probably find opportunities. What we can do is make it harder, make the risk of detection higher, make would-be killers think twice. And we can train investigators to recognize patterns, to connect cases that might seem unrelated. If we had connected the missing hikers earlier, identified the pattern, we might have caught Grant before he killed Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre. Epilogue. The Overland Track is still walked by thousands of people each year. Plaques at the northern and southern ends now memorialize those who died there, including Lars Andersson, Kathrin Schmidt, and Pierre Dubois. The inscription reads, "In memory of those whose adventures ended in tragedy, may their love of wilderness live on in all who walk this trail." The location where their camp was attacked is not specifically marked. The Park Service decided against creating what might become a morbid tourism site, but guides know the spot and occasionally mention the story to hikers as a reminder to stay vigilant and respect wilderness safety protocols. Douglas Grant's journals and trophy collection are stored in police archives, occasionally accessed by researchers studying serial killers and criminal psychology. His case is taught in criminology courses as an example of how someone can hide in plain sight by exploiting remote locations and gaps in communication between jurisdictions. The families of Grant's 17 confirmed victims have formed a support network, meeting annually to remember their loved ones and advocate for wilderness safety. They've successfully lobbied for improved tracking technology, better ranger training, and increased resources for investigating missing persons in remote areas. Lars Andersson's parents died without ever knowing their son's fate. They passed away in 2008 and 2010, before Grant was identified. But Lars's brother Hans attended the final memorial service in 2016. When Douglas Grant's identification as the killer was publicly announced, he spoke about his brother's love of nature and adventure, about how Lars had died doing something he loved, and about how important it was that the killer had finally been identified. Kathrin Schmidt's sister became a wilderness guide, channeling her grief into helping others safely experience the outdoors. She leads annual memorial hikes on the Overland Track, turning the location of tragedy into a celebration of her sister's adventurous spirit. Pierre Dubois' photographs from his final trip were recovered from Grant's camp and returned to his family. They published them in a book titled Last Light, Pierre Dubois' Tasmania, which sold internationally and raised funds for organizations protecting wilderness areas. Pierre's final images showed the stunning beauty of Tasmania: mountains, forests, lakes, reminders of why people are drawn to wild places despite the risks. The case changed Australian law enforcement's approach to missing persons in wilderness areas. A national database now tracks disappearances, looking for patterns that might indicate serial predators. Rangers receive training in recognizing signs of foul play versus natural misadventure. International cooperation has improved, with foreign governments receiving updates on cases involving their citizens. But for all the systemic improvements, the human tragedy remains. 3 young people, Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre, went for a hike in 1996 and never came home. They became part of Tasmania's landscape in the worst way, their bodies hidden in caves and forests, their potential unrealized, their families shattered. Douglas Grant escaped justice by dying before he could be tried, but his legacy is infamy, a cautionary tale about the monsters that can hide in remote places, waiting for opportunities that civilization's reach can't prevent. The wilderness is still beautiful. The trails are still walked. Adventure still calls to young people seeking experiences beyond their ordinary lives. But now, perhaps, they walk with more awareness that nature isn't the only danger in remote places. Sometimes the threat is human, calculating and deadly. Lars, Kathrin, and Pierre have not been forgotten. Their story endures as both tragedy and warning. The trail of terror that began in March 1996 finally ended with Grant's death in 2015, but its echoes continue. Every hiker who registers for a wilderness trek, every ranger who patrols remote areas, every family who reminds their children to stay safe, they are all responding to the lesson those 3 backpackers taught through their deaths. The wilderness demands respect, preparation, and constant vigilance. The vanished are found. The mystery is solved, but the loss remains. Permanent and irreparable. That is the true ending, not justice or closure, but simply the acknowledgement that evil existed, acted, and left wounds that will never fully heal.